Well, as I said, it's so good to see you all today. It's been fun getting to hear everybody chattering. In fact, I know the kids were a little loud, but it's kind of fun to just hear them and have them here with us. So it's great to see you all. I've noticed as I've been prepping for the sermons that a lot of the people we've been looking at are people VeggieTales covered when I was a kid. I was a good pastor's kid. I saw every VeggieTales that ever came out. And I've noticed that a lot of these stories are on repeat. But I've also noticed that a lot of these stories are a little different than the VeggieTales I remember. Right? VeggieTales makes everybody look nice and pretty, and everything ends in a happy ending. You're all good to go. But with some of these characters that we've been looking at, that's not so much the case, right? They're a little more messy, a little more chaotic, a little more controversial. And so this morning we're going to continue to look at some of these different interesting people that God has been using to bring about his mission in the world. And we looked at Moses, who we talked about was very self-conscious. He was a murderer. He raised as an Egyptian, but was an Israelite. And God used him to free his people from Egypt. Then we looked at Rahab, who was an outsider, led a very sinful life, was not Israelite whatsoever. But God used her to both help the people of Israel when they were supposed to take over the Promised Land, but also to bring about the Messiah a few hundred years later. And last week we looked at a man named Jonah, who God wanted to use to save this foreign nation, but he refused. And only after a series of very unfortunate events, reluctantly went to Nineveh and did the least amount possible to fulfill God's calling. And God ended up using the sinful city and a simple plant to get his message across to Jonah instead. And today we're going to look at a couple of characters who play a significant role in God's mission. One who you're probably familiar with, it's another good VeggieTales character by the name of Daniel and Brad, Shaq, and Benny, in case anybody else grew up on VeggieTales. But there's also a couple other characters that we're going to talk about who you probably don't think about. There are two men by the name of Darius and Cyrus. Now the story of Daniel is a very fascinating one because it takes place after the nation of Israel has been split into two, and both the north and south kingdoms are now in exile. And this sort of exile is different than when they were in Egypt. While they were in Egypt serving as slaves, they didn't have any real rights, but they were still allowed to live together with their families, continue on with their religion and their culture, as long as it didn't interfere with their duties to serve Egypt. But not this time. Not with Daniel. You see, for Daniel, what they did is they went into everywhere that they conquered and they ripped families apart. They moved people around. They placed new people from other nations in with the existing ones in an attempt to rid them of their nationality and rid them of their religions and make them solely Babylonians. And so this is where we first get introduced into the young man named Daniel. See, the Babylonians were smart in their military tactics. They didn't just divide and denationalize the places they conquered, but they also sought out the people in those communities who had promise for being really beneficial to the Babylonian government. And they trained them and they educated them in the ways of the Babylonian Empire and put them in places of power. And Daniel and his three friends were marked for their intelligence and brought in to serve the nation of Babylon. And what follows this initial relocation and new assignment are some of the most bizarre and fascinating stories in the Old Testament. First, we find that the men are given meat to eat that went against the Jewish culture. They would sacrifice to idols. There was the king's food. It was supposed to be really good. It was a treat for them. It was an honor bestowed on these men. But it went against the laws of the Jewish culture. And so in an effort to remain faithful to God, the God they served, they begged the people watching over them and overseeing them that they'd be allowed to only eat vegetables and drink water instead. And after a lot of argument and concern that they were going to wilt away and then the people in charge were going to get in trouble, they finally agree, and it turns out that these men were healthier and stronger than all the men eating the king's food, which they could not make sense of, but it was because they remained faithful. And then we get this really strange situation where this king has a dream. And this dream upsets him, and he calls all the wise men around to come and interpret this dream for him. Except unlike, normal things where, I tell you I had this dream and you tell me what it means, he's decided to throw them a curveball. He says not only do they have to interpret the dream, but they first have to tell him what the dream was. not your standard practice. He didn't want to tell them what the dream was because he was pretty smart. He knew that his wise men would make something up to appease him, and he wanted to know what the dream really meant. And obviously the wise man can't do what he asks, and so he orders every wise man in the entire Babylonian Empire to be killed immediately, which included Daniel and his friends. But Daniel pleads with the king to allow him to pray to his God and reveal the meaning of his dream. And the king allows it, and Daniel is shown by God what the dream was and what it means. And Daniel saves the lives of the wise men by revealing what the dream was, what it means. The king is satisfied, and he puts Daniel in a prominent role of leadership in the Babylonian Empire because of his ability to do what no one else could do. And one would think that after a while, after Daniel had pulled off this impossible act, that his life would be smooth sailing from this point on, right? He's in a good place of power, the king likes him, he's proven his worth and the strength of his God. What more could the Babylonian leaders possibly need from him? But of course, it's not that simple for Daniel because remember how I said the Babylonians wanted to denationalize everybody? Well, Daniel was trying to remain an Israelite, following God in this nation that didn't want him to. And so ultimately, this leads to a lot more conflict for Daniel. The next thing the Bible tells us after Daniel is put into this powerful position is that the Babylonian king decides to make an image of himself that everyone must worship. And of course, that's a big problem for these Israelite men because they know they're only supposed to worship God. And so ultimately, Daniel's 3 friends are found out to be refusing to bow down to this idol and thrown into a fiery furnace that is so hot that the heat from it kills the men who walk them in. Before they even get to the furnace, the ones forcing them into the furnace are dead. But 3 men go in, unharmed at that moment, and so they wait for the inevitable, and they go to check, and they realize there's not 3 men, but 4, and they're confused, and not only are there 4 men, but none of them seem to be hurt at all. And so God protects them and sends an angel to guard them, and everyone freaks out wondering how this has happened, and they're called out to come report, to figure out what's going on. They're unharmed. And the king himself praises their God for his power and promotes these 3 to high power along with Daniel. So now we've had 3 miraculous acts, right? They were able to eat food that shouldn't have made them healthy. That did. They were able to interpret a dream that they shouldn't have been able to know. They did. They went into a fiery furnace that should have killed them instantly, and they lived. You would think that this would convince the king of Babylon that the Israelite God was the true God. They had now experienced 3 miraculous events through these 4 men in the name of the Israelite God. And yet that still wasn't enough. Then we see Daniel interpreting dreams for the king, in which the king is driven insane because he fails to humble himself before God. He becomes like a wild animal, unable until he finally submits and is restored to his former self. And finally, it seems like once this king finally humbles himself before God, that now the Israelites are okay. The Babylonian king finally understands who this Israelite God is. But this doesn't really last for very long because soon this king is replaced by his son, Belshazzar. And Belshazzar didn't learn from his father's mistakes. He didn't pay attention to anything that had happened so far. And so he decides that he's going to prove just how powerful he is by shoving it in the Israelites' faces. And he throws this huge banquet in which he uses the things stolen out of the temple of the Israelite God to praise himself and his own gods. He's trying to make a mockery of the Israelite God. When suddenly, at this party, a disembodied hand starts writing on the wall in a language nobody could read. Now, if that happened in like a horror movie, right? Everybody's sitting in their cabin and all of a sudden this hand starts writing on the wall, right? Horror movie, if anybody watches those, I'm not a huge fan, but I'd imagine everybody starts standing up, screaming and running, trying to get away, right? That's not supposed to happen. And in a horror movie, right, we know something bad's going to happen and it doesn't get any better from there. But we know that the reaction is going to be right? Run away, screaming. So this is happening in real life. This isn't even Hollywood. And you'd think their reaction would be the same. But it's not. The king is scared, but instead of trying to do anything to save his life, he calls for them to find someone who can interpret the words on the wall. And this someone, of course, ends up being Daniel. And Daniel tells him that the writing means that he refused to humble himself before God, and he's going to be killed. And you would think at this point that the king would start to grovel and beg for his life, right? That would be normal. This disembodied hand wrote on the wall. All these things happened to his father that he would have known about. Now he's being told he's going to die because he refused to humble. And you'd think that would be his response. Begging, pleading, repenting. But unlike his father, who eventually humbled himself before God, he refuses. And so he continues the party, continues celebrating, continues going on making a mockery of God, but he places Daniel in a higher role of importance in the kingdom. Doesn't learn. And that very night, Belshazzar is assassinated and killed. And with this assassination comes the rise of a new empire and the start of our story today. A man named Darius, one of those names I said would be important later, takes the place as king over the territory Daniel is in and serving. And Darius is under the leadership of another man named Cyrus, who is a Persian. So this is a switch from Babylonian to Persian rule. And normally when empires take over, the leadership kind of gets wiped out. Daniel is in one of those main leadership points. And so there's a big potential for Daniel and his friends to be removed and killed along with some of the other leaders. But Daniel's remained faithful, and so he stays in leadership. And so now he's got a prominent government role, not only under the Babylonian Empire, but under the Persian one as well. And under the first two leaders, under the Babylonians, we've seen Daniel with countless life-threatening experiences pointing at him, and he comes out the victor because of his faithfulness in God. He does impossible tasks, but each time God acts in his life, and he remains faithful, and he is the one who comes out victorious. And so here's where we're going to pick up and read in the text in Daniel chapter 6, if you want to grab your Bibles. We find in Daniel, in the middle of one empire falling and one rising to power, that everything that has happened to Daniel, good, bad, and ugly, he has remained faithful, and God has remained victorious. But Daniel's life has been anything but easy. And now Daniel is faced with a whole new difficulty as he encounters the new leadership of the Persian Empire. So let's read Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. The story will probably sound familiar to you. Like I said, this is one of those VeggieTale stories. And so if you grew up in church or watched any of these shows growing up, went to Bible school, anything, you probably have heard it. But I want you to listen carefully to the text because there's a lot going on that would not make it into one of those pretty children's stories that most of us heard growing up. So follow along as we read from Daniel chapter 6. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps that by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." See where this is going? We're going to deal with the same people before did. So these administrators and satraps went on as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever! The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now your majesty, according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Starting to grovel and promote, right? You'd think you'd want something from it, right? If my kid came up with, "Hey, Mom, you're just so wonderful and pretty," right? All the moms in here are thinking, "What do you want? What'd you do?" Right? You'd think the king would be a little bit suspicious, but he's not. He is flattered instead, and so King Darius put the decree in writing. He doesn't even think about it. He's like, of course I'm awesome. Let's put this in writing, make everybody bow down to me for 30 days. And now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put into writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so the Daniel situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, the Persian. This is the word of the Lord. So here we find Daniel, who is so good at his job and his role in the Persian government. The king wants to make him the ruler of the entire region, placing him above not only the 120 men, but the other two that were at his level. And suddenly, everyone is jealous and wants to get rid of Daniel. And they do everything in their power to show that Daniel needs to be removed from office. But Daniel is so trustworthy, so honest, so competent, and so faithful that they can't find a single thing to report him on. Can you think of anyone in any job that you've ever had, that you've ever seen that is that good at their job? Even the best coworkers and bosses have made mistakes, but Daniel doesn't. There's absolutely nothing they can even bring up to begin building a case against him, except by using his own strengths against him. Now imagine our president was like Daniel. Honest, fair, trustworthy, competent, faithful, so much so that not even those running against him in office could find one flaw in him. Wouldn't the others in leadership want that person to be in charge? Don't we all wish we had a person like that running our country? You would think that upon realizing that Daniel was a truly great leader, the others would fall in line and do their best to live up to their roles under him. But these men are the opposite of Daniel, and they can't stand that he has more power than them, so they create a plan to trick the king of Persia into having him kill Daniel himself. There's a few dumb choices here, right? First, we've already learned from the story of Daniel that trying to go against the God of Daniel is a bad idea. But not only that, they're trying to trick the king into doing something he doesn't want to do. This king who has the power to kill any and all of them if he wishes. And as we read this story, we realize that their plan works, sort of. But even the king himself is hoping and praying that somehow Daniel will be saved. He's bound by law to follow through with his decree, but he spends the entire day trying to find some sort of loophole. And when he doesn't, he makes a plea for Daniel's God to save him. The God that Daniel had chosen to worship over him. This king is now seeking that God's help. And Daniel is saved. The king is happy and praises Daniel's God as the one true God. And they all live happily ever after. Well, not the men who tricked the king into killing Daniel, but Daniel's story is better after that. The story concludes with a nice summary of Daniel prospering during the reign of King Darius, and we're introduced to this man named Cyrus. Now this last little verse may seem like a little bit of a throwaway verse at first glance. Yay, Daniel's safe and happy, and oh, they gave us a timeline for these events by telling us who was in charge. Cool. The end. But to an Israelite reading this passage, the passage had a lot more meaning. You see, Cyrus, the king of Persia, was the next great leader to rise to power, and he took over all the nations that the Babylonian Empire had conquered. However, unlike the Babylonian leaders, Cyrus wanted to take care of the people under his control, to some extent. It was under his leadership that all the Jews were permitted to return home and begin rebuilding their cities and homes. Instead of denationalizing his people, he encouraged their individual beliefs and customs so long as they remained faithful to the Persian government as well. In fact, this picture here is an artifact found in 1879 called the Cyrus Cylinder, and on it is a decree allowing all of the exiled people to return home and rebuild. This is one of many official documents sent out by Cyrus himself to the various areas that effectively ended the exile, not only for the Israelites, but all the other conquered nations as well. And there's a very strong probability that if Daniel hadn't served Darius so faithfully, who then served Cyrus, this decree and this respect for the exiled people may never have happened. God used these three men to begin the process of restoring Israel to the people God had called them to be. And so I wanted to look at this story of Daniel today for a number of reasons. But the most prominent one is that there are a lot of people who are saying that we as Christians today are facing some sort of exile as well. Now, we aren't enslaved and tortured and suffering in the ways as the Israelites had been. We're not imprisoned or threatened to be killed because of our faith, at least not here in America. But there is still some truth to this idea that we are in exile. We were never intended to live in the sinful, broken world that we do. And we know that there is something more we are called to. We know that God's kingdom, the kingdom of wholeness and healing, is coming. And we long for the day when we are no longer exiles in this broken world and instead restored to the promised kingdom of God. And so I wanted to look at Daniel in order for us to understand how we can be faithful in exile. We know Daniel was faithful to the point of being willing to put his life in danger many times in order to follow who God called him to be. And there's a lot we can learn on how we can live as well. First, we must be people God called us to be in the present world we live in. Daniel was ripped from his home and everything he knew in order to serve this new government. He could have chosen to run and hide and remove himself from the temptations and influences of this other culture, but instead he decided to be the best Israelite in a foreign land that he could be. He learned their culture and their language, he did his duties to the very best of his abilities, and he only challenged them when it directly contradicted who he was supposed to be in light of who God had called him to be. And for us as Christians today, it can be tempting to hide and close ourselves off from the non-Christian culture all around us, bunker down with like-minded people, and wait for the kingdom of God to show up. But if Daniel had done that, if he hadn't done the best he could with what he was given, he would have never been in the position to be a witness for God to the godless around him. And so we too must be willing to go into the world and be who God called us to be, inside the culture we live in. We have to be people known for being faithful and honest and trustworthy in everything we do, so that when people question us and wonder why we're so different, we can be effective witnesses for Christ to those around us. Second, we must not give into the culture and brokenness around us. Daniel was given every opportunity and reason to falter on his faithfulness to God. His friends, his job, his resources, even his life was put on the line when he chose to go against the culture of the Babylonians. It would have been easy for him that first time when he was offered meat to eat, for him to just give in and eat it, instead of fighting to remain faithful to the diet God had called him to. But there's a theologian and biblical scholar who is much smarter than I am, named Tim Mackey, who put this in a better understanding. He said, being in exile in a foreign land is much like trying to swim upstream in a river. It's extremely hard work just to stay in place and not get swept away by the current, let alone make any progress going upstream. But if you are a strong swimmer, you could do it. However, as soon as you stop swimming and take a break, you are quickly swept into the current and carried away. And being faithful to who God has called us to be is like being in that river, trying to swim upstream. It is incredibly difficult, and everything around you is telling you to just give in. Let the river carry you for a little while. You can get back to it later. But once you give in, even a little bit, you are carried away to a place far from where you wanted to be. So too is it with us with the choices we make. It may not seem like such a big deal to just this once go with the culture, even when we know God is calling us to something different. But when we do, it is instantly easier for us to keep making the wrong choices. And soon we find ourselves so far from where God has called us to be, and we're not even quite sure how we got there. Daniel chose that while he was in exile, he would remain faithful, even in the little things. And then when the big things came along, he was strong enough to stand his ground. And this is a choice we are faced with too. Are we going to remain faithful in the small things so that we can face the big things, knowing we are following God? Or are we going to tell that little white lie, cheat on that one little test, say something mean about that one annoying person, refuse to help that one person in need, ignore the person who is being treated unjustly, just this once, telling ourselves that next time we'll do the right thing. But this is an exception, not the rule to how we're going to live our lives. That we are good people following God, but we just make mistakes every once in a while. We can't help it. And suddenly find ourselves making even bigger choices that are in opposition to who God has called us to be. And we sit there wondering how we ever strayed so far. And the final thing we can learn from Daniel is that we need to expect God to use the unexpected. This whole series has been focused on this one theme, but none highlight it more than I think Daniel does. Sure, Daniel is the one we expect God to use, right? He's faithful, he's trustworthy, he's honest, he's good at his job. But he's not ultimately the one who saves God's people from exile. Instead, God uses two Persian rulers, men who had everything and everyone at their disposal and everything to lose by following God, who could have continued on as they were, and no one would have thought worse for them. But through Daniel's witness and God's working in the lives of these men, they chose to treat the people under their rule with care and respect and allow them to return to their homes, their families, and their own cultures. And not only that, but the Persian ruler who follows Cyrus uses his own money and resources to fund the rebuilding of Jerusalem and especially the temple of the Israelite God. None of this makes sense from a human perspective. All of these leaders had every right by human standards to keep the Israelites as they were, to keep their own money for themselves, to keep going the way they had always been. But when God is working and his people are rising to who they are called to be, God can do things beyond any human understanding. And so the question remains for us today, are we going to be faithful to God, swimming upstream, making the tough choices, even when something we value is on the line? Are we going to be the best people that we can be in this world so that we can be effective witnesses to those around us? Are we going to be people that others can experience God through so that God can do unexpected things through unexpected people? As we close, I want to hear this prayer from John chapter 17 as our benediction. This is the prayer Jesus prayed over his disciples and those who believed in him as a result of their witness. Stand with me as we hear this prayer in closing. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, so that they may be brought to complete unity, that the world will know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Amen. Go in peace.